Hey everyone, I'm now on Patreon. Click the link below. Not only keep the free content coming with tutorials, tips, podcasts, etc., but get a bunch of free stuff like live stream Q&As, copy of my book, voting on topics, behind the scenes, bunch of cool stuff. Click the link down below to join. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 13 of the Scott Stokely podcast. I have on the show today an expert in the field of artificial intelligence, Scott Christianson from the University of Missouri. And real quickly, the reason why I am excited to explore this topic is that I love talking about things that are controversial, with the exception of religion and politics, but I love controversial topics. The problem is with many, I'm going to put quotes around them, controversial topics, is that if you dig just a little bit deeper, you find that on one side of the controversy are all or most of the intelligent, educated, well-read people that work in that industry. And on the other side of the controversy are conspiracy theorists and bloggers and YouTubers. And so there's not really a controversy to dig into for more than a few minutes. However, artificial intelligence, and I'm going to ask if I'm accurate with this, that has not been my observation. On one side of artificial intelligence, or the controversy, are intelligent, educated people who work in the field who have touted this as possibly the greatest thing humans have ever done. It's going to raise us out of poverty. There's no longer going to be wars, right? We're going to solve every medical issue ever created, right? We're going to hold on a second.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Yep. We're going to rewind again. It's 497-180. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to go back to the beginning. I'm just going to go with the problem with. Okay. The problem with many of these, I'm going to put quotes around it, controversies, is that when you dig just a little bit deeper, you'll find that on one side of the controversy are people who are educated, who work in that industry, who are reasonable. On the other side of the controversy are conspiracy theorists and bloggers and some well-intentioned YouTubers. But you can't really have a conversation about something that isn't actually controversial. At least I don't find those conversations interesting. Artificial intelligence, my observation has been that it is the opposite. On one side of the table, you have educated, reasonable people who work in the field who have touted this as the greatest thing humans have ever created. It's going to raise the poor out of poverty. It's going to do things in the field of medicine that we couldn't have even imagined 5 years ago. And it's the savior of mankind. And on the other side of the table, you have people that think that the wage or the inequality gap is going to be the largest in human history, irreversibly, that someday machines will become sentient and enslave or kill all of us. The difference in this topic is that those people that are afraid of artificial intelligence are not crackpots. These are intelligent, educated people who work in the field as well. They're well-read. They come from academia. It seems as though there is not a consensus other than it's going to be one or the other. There's not a lot of people I have found that are in the middle. So I wanted to talk to an expert on the topic. So thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It sounds like we're going to have a good controversial talk here.
I'm excited. Now, I want to dive deep quickly, but first, if we could just take a minute, tell me a little bit about yourself, what got you interested in the field, what you're currently working on, and then I'll start picking your brain.
Yeah, so I have a great job. I'm a teaching professor at the University of Missouri, so I just focus on teaching. And one of the things that I'm very interested in talking to my students about is what is the future going to be like, and how is technology going to influence the future? I used to run my own IT business, so we were always having to look at what are the new technologies coming out, what is going to be the landscape in a year or 2 years or more in our industry. And students are going to have to do that even more than I did, because I think the pace of change is in fact changing. It's going even more rapidly, especially with the current COVID crisis. We're starting to see changes that might have taken 10 years happening very quickly. And I think as we come out of this crisis, we're also going to see the adoption of AI as we kind of rebuild our supply chains, rebuild our economies, being used even more and more. So there are a lot of considerations that we have to make about where are we going to apply this? Where is AI a useful tool, and where is it maybe a dangerous tool? And so I think that when I look at all the different emerging technologies, so Internet of Things and blockchain and other technologies, I think AI is going to be the one that's going to be in all of these things, and is probably going to have the most influence on our society and our world, either for good or bad, in the next decades.
I think that's interesting. You are a professor at the University of Missouri. And it sounds like you could sit down to dinner with an economist and a philosopher and have the same conversation you would have with two other AI specialists as far as your area of expertise.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things that we get into as far as ethics when it comes to technology. And it's kind of funny because we have to review our course syllabi and what we do in the courses, and there was a big emphasis, are you discussing anything about ethics? I'm like, we have a hard time not discussing, because just about every technology that you come up with has an ethical implication. And I think some of the things you mentioned as far as AI haves and AI have-nots. So when you start to look at some of the great advances in medicine, maybe you and I will have access to that AI, but will there be another kind of almost another digital divide, right? So there's countries that maybe will not have access to those AIs that can benefit, their citizens. So there's a lot of issues coming down the pike. Also, how this AI is being used for making decisions about our lives. So for my students, are we going to use an AI to determine whether they get into college or not? Well, I would argue that's a bad use of AI. I think some people might do that with good intentions, but find that they are in fact creating or embedding more biases into these AIs.
So I need to know my assessment of the controversy. I want to know if it's accurate, because even as you talk about medicine, I think that you're going to have half the people saying radiology is going to be so much better than it has ever been because AI is doing it. And then there's people on the other side saying, but what about all the radiologists out of work?
That's I think that's where we first go, is thinking it's one or the other. There's a book called Deep Medicine by Eric Toffler. I highly recommend that if you're interested in exploring this. He thinks that what we're going to have is the job of radiologist will change. And the radiologist isn't just going to be more of a kind of a technician looking at the imaging data, but they're going to work alongside AI and bring in other areas, maybe also have more emotional intelligence. So being able to say, well, Scott Christianson, we think he has this particular malady, but we know from talking with him, he's probably not going to respond well to changing his lifestyle or something like that. Where Scott Stokely is going to be, he's a little bit more in the forefront with his athletic abilities in disc golf. And so therefore, maybe we can put out a regime for treatment that's going to be different for him. So maybe these roles are going to change. So that's rather than just being outright replaced, they may change in their nature. How do you bring together different pieces of information? Because one of the things that we have found is that machine learning or AI can be very good at detecting, let's say a cancer in a pathology sample, and a different AI can be good at looking at an X-ray, but you can't take one of these AIs and have them do the other job, right? So it's really, you still need a human to kind of integrate all the data together. And so that's, I think that's going to be one area that we will see some great advances in. There is a big concern with AI as to replacing people, right? So replacing all these jobs. And a lot of people are arguing that this is going to be a very different type of technological revolution than we've seen in the past. So back when I started college, we still had typists. There was still a steno pool at the University of Missouri. Those jobs are gone, but we have an IT department, right? And they get paid more than the typists did. And so it kind of sucked if you were a typist and you were out of work. But as far as the economy as a whole, it grew when we had personal computers introduced. But people are kind of wondering, is this going to be different? Are we going to have an AI that just sits on one Google supercomputer and it can handle the radiology for the entire United States, right? So is it going to be, a fundamentally different shift?
Well, that's where I to take it to the extreme example, that's the part that for me as a layperson is the most concerning. The robots taking over, I do believe is a concern, but that's later. In the short, like in your example, if you get rid of coal, that's a drag for the coal workers. However, renewable energy jobs will simultaneously be created. So society-wise, it's not as much of a net loss. It is to the individual, obviously,
right.
But society, culturally, you could justify it or balance it. 10 million people drive for a living.
Right.
Like there's not 10 million replaceable jobs with AI taking over driving. I mean, how does that extreme example look?
Yeah, and so you start to find a lot of people that are even proposing ways to have some sort of basic income, right? So you look at Andrew Yang was a candidate in the presidential election on the Democratic side, and he proposed this idea of a UBI or universal basic income. Different countries are starting to experiment with this as they are dealing with COVID. There was another, Kao-Fu Lee, who wrote a book called AI Superpowers. He doesn't propose a universal basic income, but he said we should pay for people doing other types of work. So taking care of your mother or something like that when she's older, or maybe producing excellent podcasts. So maybe we'll have more and more people producing podcasts and less people driving. So how does that economy shift? How do those people find other work? It's also a matter of retraining. So if you look at some of the other industrial revolutions we've gone through before, going from the farm to the factory was probably not that hard of a shift compared to going from driving a truck to programming an AI, right? So we're also looking at, is there a place for the jobs that are going to be lost. So it's a big controversy. I'm not sure anybody has the right answer. Bill Gates has proposed an idea that you tax the robots, right? So you tax the Amazon robots the way you would tax a person as far as income.
You see, and that I do love that. By the way, I'm a huge Andrew Yang fan, and I'm a diehard capitalist. So this is, I want to scare anybody. As a diehard capitalist, I see the problems like you can see it coming. Like I could see a future where 4 companies run the country, and AI is really the catalyst to that, potentially. But I don't know. I think the challenge for me, like to tax the robots, like that is on paper sounds perfect. The problem is you're asking the several $1 trillion at this point companies to agree that they should be paying more taxes since they will have so much control. They're having to make that choice themselves. It's almost like people in Congress making decisions to hurt their own income to reduce campaign funding because it's better for the country. Well, the people empowered never give up what they have.
Right.
He loves money, but he's a freak.
Right. I think you're right. And I agree 100%. As a capitalist, I would like to see more entrepreneurship. And I know several people that would frankly quit their jobs now if they could buffer that risk a little bit. So if they had some sort of UBI, we had some sort of backstop, so they knew that they weren't going to be risking putting their entire family, on the street. If they knew they could at least subsist, they would strike out on their own and turn that little side gig into a full-time business. And I think we need more of that kind of oxygenation of our marketplace with new entrepreneurs, because these big tech companies are kind of sucking all the oxygen out of the room, right? So I think a UBI is not in any way anti-capitalist. I think it is very pro-capitalist in a lot of ways.
No, I agree. And without going down that rabbit hole too far, for anyone listening, like many people, my gut reaction to UBI was, that's a terrible idea. And search for Andrew Yang, Joe Rogan. It was the best interesting conversation on the topic that I would encourage everyone to listen to with an open mind. And then you can disagree with me afterwards, but I think that's a good starting place. One of the things that makes me nervous with AI and economics is that it also creates a barrier to competition. It's not just that Amazon can take over, but there's this point of critical mass. When you get that big, you can't build and compete the way you could, in theory, compete with. I mean, you can compete with McDonald's. You can open up a restaurant next door. McDonald's has no barrier to competition. Not prices. I mean, there's little ones, of course, but that's not the same thing that artificial intelligence can create. Does that concern you?
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways that these, we call them barriers to entry, can be, built up, or we sometimes refer to them as moats. So Google has a great moat in that not only does it have these great AIs, but it has decades of data, and it can use that decades of data to train their AIs, not only on how to deliver better search, but how to deliver better ads, and better ads to Scott, because we have lots and lots of data on Scott over the last 20 years. So if we just told Google they have to turn everything off today and have to take a 3-month timeout, go sit in the corner for 3 months, and we'll let other search engines come about, well, it would still be really difficult for a startup to come up, even if they had a better AI, to really have that historical data, right? So that idea that we have all this data exhaust. So data doesn't just exist for a little bit. I don't look up on Google Maps how to get to some place and then that goes away. For me, it kind of goes away because but for Google, they keep that knowledge. Okay, well, Scott goes to Starbucks at 8 a.m. every morning. Let's keep that data. What does that also mean? How can we correlate that with other people that go to Starbucks? Maybe he would like to buy this, other thing. And they can test, they can run experiments, and their AI can get better and better at predicting things. And they can also get better at nudging us into opinions, into ideas. And we don't like to think that we're influenceable, right? We're all rational people.
No, not me. Everyone else, not me though.
But I would tell you that from being in sales, that most decisions are made based on emotions. You need to have the facts to back it up. But like I have a friend that was going through a midlife crisis, and he bought himself a fancy sports car, and his rationale was that the lease payment was less than his truck payment was. And of course, it was a horrible deal for him because you're leasing, not buying. But he was having the emotional decision that he was having this midlife crisis. He wanted the sports car, and he couldn't just come out and say it, but he was always trying to say that how rational this decision was. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We don't like to think we can be influenced, but we certainly can. And that's where I think one of the other dangers about AI isn't necessarily that some, Terminator style AI or Skynet's going to come about, but it's going to be humans using AI against other humans, right? So tricking you into believing something that is not correct. And it's often very difficult once you believe something to convince somebody that that's not true, right? So there's this expression, it's easier to fool somebody than to make them understand they've been fooled, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, that's just some of our biases that come in from being a human that have served us well for millennia, but may not serve us well in the age of AI.
So something you had just mentioned about the ad, I mean, that's one of those areas where we all get like emotionally a little bit creeped out at having a conversation and then an ad pops up, and it happens too much to be coincidence. Like we know things are going on behind the scenes, obviously. But at the same time, it's also wonderful when I watch a YouTube video and I get recommended other YouTube videos that are of interest to me. Now, is that, like, for example, the YouTube algorithm, would that be considered artificial intelligence in your definition, or is that just an algorithm?
I do believe it incorporates some, it's training, it's learning as it goes along, right? So there is an algorithm there that is being trained. So it's not just a human entered, calculation, but it is in fact using machine learning for these recommendation engines. It's an interesting way in which these things are being used, and we don't often know that they're being used, right? So your Facebook feed, your Twitter feed, your recommendations on YouTube, those are all using AIs and using a lot of data about you. I always say that there's this balance, this tipping point between convenience and creepy, right? So it's convenient that we get the ads that we want when we want them. It's convenient that we see the YouTube videos that keep us engaged. But at another point, there's kind of this creepiness, like, oh, do I really want Google to have all this data about me? And for everybody, there's different levels of that. For my mom, she doesn't even like spell check on Microsoft Word. She thinks that's too creepy. How does it know what I want to spell it as? And so she's very much, cleans her cookies after every session, and, very much does not like the whole Google universe. And for other people, it's going to be somewhere else, right? And when we look at AI, there's some really interesting applications with actually listening to your voice to be able to determine mood. So Amazon has a new kind of Fitbit tracker thing, but it listens to your voice. You can't tell it to, order stuff for you, but it can tell your mood. So that might be good, right? So if I'm getting to the point of I might, maybe I'm really depressed and about to, attempt something bad as far as self-harm. Well, that might be good, but it's pretty damn creepy, right?
Right.
So we really have to start to strike this balance. And that's one of the reasons I come on these podcasts, is to try to start, more conversations about it. There's some great things, but what are we giving up as well?
So here, no pressure here, but I'm going to ask you to solve one of YouTube's biggest issues.
Okay.
No pressure. But I was listening to an interview, and they were talking about this as one of their biggest issues. I have this belief, honestly, quick aside, I really do think Google is the good guys. I mean, I'm afraid of every major corporation, but if somebody has to be Google, I am glad it's Google. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're the old, barons or whatever. Right. I think Google's pretty good, but one of the problems they have is that the longer you stay on YouTube and the more videos you watch, the more ads get shared, the more revenue that comes in, the more the shareholders' prices go up. They need more clicks. That's their model, and their algorithm, and I guess it would be driven by AI. And I've heard they don't know how to do anything about this. Is that clickbait, fear-based, controversial, people that think things differently than you get more clicks than not doing that.
Right.
And it, even to a point where just things becoming more extreme are going to get more clicks. When you search for jogging, you wind up with extreme running. Mm-hmm. And in the interview, they were expressing, and I felt it was sincere, like, we don't want to be a fear-based, fear-mongering system. However, our algorithm, that's what it gives us back when we tell the AI effectively, we want more clicks because it brings in more revenue. Is there a solution to this? I mean, can AI become so evolved that you can actually put in the human intentions into the equation? Or at some point, do you have to program it to judge whether something's scary? I don't know. Is it?
Well, you're not going to believe this, but I don't have the answer to that. But I will tell you that It's interesting. You have to also realize that Google can't just shut down for a weekend and say, we're going to try some new algorithm, right? So it's one of these things that you're continually, it's kind of like changing a race car's tires while it's still running at 200 miles an hour. And so as they tweak this system, their machine learning algorithms are optimized for getting you to stay on the site and click on more things, because that's how they make their money. You don't pay unless you pay for YouTube Red, which is like $10 a month. Most people don't, which lets you not see the ads. Most people don't do that. They are willing to see the ads or skip the ads to watch the videos. And so that's part of all these free services. Well, they're making their money some way, and they are going to try to keep you engaged. Now, these machine learning algorithms may have not been programmed to optimize for controversial content, but they are certainly optimized to keep you on the site and to keep you clicking more. And when that happens, it's often that content that's controversial that keeps you doing that. And certainly on Facebook, that's another example of where you might, if you just saw some nice, photos once a week from your friends and you compare to, anniversaries or something like that, you might not stay on Facebook that long. Maybe you check it an hour a week or something like that. But if you see some controversial videos, see some controversial posts, if you see things that are trending that make you upset, well, maybe you're going to stay on there longer. And there is a good documentary, you probably have watched it on Netflix, called The Social Dilemma. And in that, Tristan Harris, who's from the Center for Humane Design, talks about the fact that he's more valuable to Facebook if he's agitated and angry.
Yeah,
right.
I've heard that. I haven't watched the documentary, but I'm familiar with that idea.
Yeah. So that's really where I'm more worried about in the short term, is humans using AI against other humans. And I think we see that, with our divisive politics here in the US. How much of that is attributable to Facebook? Well, it may be some amount, right? And we're getting into our own silos, and we're not talking with people that we disagree with. And in fact, we don't seem to be respecting the fact that the whole freedom of speech thing is about not about people that you agree with, right? It's about the people you disagree with. So I think that's problematic, that we're posting to each other and we're not talking to each other really.
No, I agree. I would love to stay on this point for hours, but I know your time's limited, so I do want to get to. I do have a bulleted point list of my agenda. Okay, so computers are getting smarter, and they're getting faster. When they get faster, it allows for artificial intelligence to evolve as well. And we're Moore's law.
Yep.
How close are we? Well, software already writes software. How close are we to software writing software when it hasn't been prompted to write software? Because right now we still have to tell it to do it and program a way of it doing it, right?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's hard to tell. Certainly, I think that a lot of people think we need some major breakthroughs, like something like quantum computing, in order to get to something that would really be, conscious, if you will, and be able to make not only decisions. Artificial intelligence, that's one of our definitions, is able to decide or to make a choice, but be able to make decisions about things we haven't prompted it for, right? So this idea that a machine would go off and do its own thing. There's some really interesting stuff coming from OpenAI, and they have done several examples where they've set up games and had AIs play themselves, and they figured out different ways to play these games. So you don't even have to tell it the rules of the game per se. You can enforce those rules and just have the AI play itself. For example, playing chess, and it can then learn how to play chess better than a human. And so there are some really interesting things that are happening where AI is able to see solutions that we haven't seen before as well. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see where this could lead. There is one thing I wanted to mention in case you or your listeners want to try it out. You might just Google search universal paper clips. And this is where you actually play an AI, and you're an AI that has been tasked with making paper clips. And you keep on doing so until you turn the entire universe into paper clips. Okay, so it's a AI problem called instrumental convergence, where you set an AI to do something, and it does it, and it just keeps on doing this without with disregard to other consequences like human well-being and you know, whether the Earth is a bunch of paper clips or an actual planet, and so that's one of the things that people have talked about as being problems, not necessarily that it would be, once again, some malevolent AI, but an AI that would be so focused on something else, or an AI that might also kind of treat us like house cats, right? So that we're around and we are interesting little things to keep track of, but it really has some other purpose. And you're right about this expandability of a computer. So I can't increase my intelligence by slapping on another skull and increasing my brain size. But if Google wants to increase its computing power, it adds another data center, right? And it can expand that. So there are some things that are very different about computers and how they grow and how they increase in capabilities. So if you had a computer that was kind of at the level of a village idiot, the person that maybe I shouldn't be using that term anymore, but you kind of know what I mean, the person with the lowest intelligence that you know of. And you look at between that and Einstein, well, that's not a big jump. And if you talk about doubling every so many years or so many months, well, you could see if you got an AI up to that level, it could grow rather rapidly into something that had far superior intelligence to humans. And that's where you get Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking and several other people talking about the dangers of AI. So it's not necessarily that the AI will look at us as something to fight, but that it may just decide that humans really aren't that important in the whole scheme of things. It has better things to do, whether it's making paper clips or hopefully something better than that, right? So,
yeah, the scariest one I ever heard was when one person said, why do you think AI is going to want to destroy and enslave us? That's crazy to think that AI would be malicious. And the response was, well, when you build a house, are you malicious when you kill the ants? Or do you just not notice ants are there?
right.
And that made me a bit nervous. So that's a question about quantum computers, because for those listening, Moore's law it's not really a law, but it's a prediction that computer speeds will double, I believe, every 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's been going on since, I think, the late 60s or something. But microprocessors can only get so small. You can only fit so many on a chip. And then I was even reading that even when you add databases on, literally the speed of light there's still a finite speed that somewhere around 2030 we're probably going to cap. Mm-hmm. But quantum computers just becomes irrelevant. Do you think it's going to take quantum computers to make the next leap, or do you think that this could happen in the next 10 years? Because we're still going to get faster.
Well, and quantum computers may come sooner than we think. There's Google and Microsoft and IBM have been all making pretty big strides in this, and certainly the counterparts in China have as well. Okay. Yeah, I think that Moore's law is running out, so it's not doubling every 2 years. It used to be like every 18 months, then it's like every 2 years, and now it's like every 2 to 3 years, something like that. I forget exactly where it's at now. And Gordon Moore has predicted the end of Moore's law as well, for a lot of the reasons that you just mentioned. But we're able to have multi-core computers, right? So even your phone now has multiple cores. It has dedicated processors. Those are essentially like multiple computers inside of one. We're able to have a lot of these applications in the cloud where we can just add another rack of servers if we need to double the capability. And so that whole cloud computing is another whole area where we talk about barriers actually decreasing dramatically. So some of my students that are starting their own businesses have leveraged this in some tremendous ways, because they don't have to go out and get a big loan to buy a bunch of servers and all this kind of infrastructure. They just get out a credit card and they use Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure or whatever, and they build up their application and they're off and running. And so that cloud computing revolution is going to be another thing that kind of goes hand in hand and enables AI. So there's another site you guys might want to check out. It's called Edge Impulse. It's actually a company, and I use their product in my class because you can use it for free. And you can actually use your cell phone to train an AI. And you should go through and do the tutorial. This only takes about an hour, but you can actually see that you can train a neural net, and it's all out in the cloud. So when you get all your data ready and you press train, it says, okay, queuing it up on the server. And you have to sit there for a little bit. And then maybe 5 minutes later, it starts training the AI. And about 5 minutes after that, you've got your AI trained with all this data. And, it's ready to go. And it's all graphical, all very user-friendly. So you don't have to know a lot about discrete math or anything like that. So that's another example of this cloud computing, just enabling people to use AI in all sorts of applications. And I've gotten far away from the original question.
No, great. Well, so that actually brings another question then, because when you're saying the individual can train AI, is that something that's scary? Like when I think about, they talk about 3D printers getting better and better until someday we could actually reproduce an airborne Ebola virus. And I'm not afraid of Google producing the Ebola virus. I'm afraid of some guy in Nova Scotia. By the way, that's the way I was avoiding pick the wrong country,
right?
Racial landmine. So the guy in Nova Scotia, sorry, Nova Scotia, but that's the fear. It's the individual or the individual nation states, small nation states usually. Is that a fear with AI, that you're giving too much power to too many people? Is that a concern?
Yes. So the democratization of AI may bring all sorts of great things. We may be able to have researchers using these tools that, couldn't afford it. Maybe they'll study something about climate change. There's all sorts of, great applications. But could I also have like I've got a little device here that's under $100. It will do facial recognition very well. It can control servos, so little motors. It can control motors and everything else. I could train that to, recognize, let's say, mice and shoot them. Okay, but you can move that up to some terrorist group detecting people. Right. So it's not shooting BBs at mice in my basement, but now we're talking about AIs that could be deployed without any human around. So you set these things up and then you walk away, and then 3 weeks later they activate. It's a very big concern. And you start to look at drones and drone technology. The democratization of these technologies is great in a lot of ways, but it also has some very scary consequences for people that want to create havoc. So I am worried about this. AI in its use in warfare, it's one thing when you're talking about the U.S. military or Germany or Great Britain, because these folks can come together and have some sort of agreement about how AI is used in these circumstances, but there's a lot of states that aren't going to come to the table, right? And so I think it's a big problem.
Now, do you think that it may in fact be better that it is out there? I remember reading about back when we built the first atomic bomb, that as much as America was the land of the free and democracy and everything else, that ultimately, in the long run, the world may have been safer when someone else had the bomb also. You didn't give one nation state, even a well-intentioned one at the time, all that power. Power corrupts. And so do you feel like that ultimately it is beneficial for more people to have access to the technology, or is it just so scary that we wish we could put the genie back in the bottle?
The problem is that with nuclear weapons, there's a technological hurdle that you had to go over in order to produce a nuclear weapon, right? So you had to refine the elements, and you had to put all this stuff together. And certainly we have had some nation states that have tried to do that, like Iran, where the Western states have tried to stop them from doing this. But that's a big technological hurdle compared to having a drone, fly up somewhere and do some harm. That's where I think this is kind of fundamentally different than those other technologies. I wish it wasn't. I wish we could have, AI superpowers, and we would have some agreement between those superpowers as far as how AI is being used. But I think AI is something that is so portable, and that you could see it being used in lots of by a lot of bad actors. And once again, this is this area where we do have this kind of balance between creepy and convenient, if you will. But I ask my students about this a lot, about what do you feel about AI being used in warfare? And originally they think, well, no, I wouldn't want to have an AI controlling a machine gun. Well, then we say, well, what if your daughter joins the Marines and is now being deployed? Would you rather have her, working alongside an AI? Well, maybe I would, right? So it depends on where we sit in our situation as far as where we see these AIs being harmful or beneficial. So I don't know. I'm concerned about it. I think we have to start talking about it because I think there's some areas that we could get the genie out of the bottle and not get it back in.
All right. So you say we need to talk about it. One of the scariest things I've seen in the past 10 years was Mark Zuckerberg speaking before Congress. And I am afraid of Mark Zuckerberg, but that's not what scared me. What scared me was the gap between the people in power and the world we live in. I mean, literally, without exaggerating, if you haven't watched this, a room full of 14-year-olds, average 14-year-olds, would have asked more intelligent and reasonable questions than the people making these decisions. Does that scare you? I keep asking, does that scare you? But that's really what interests me.
Yeah, I mean, there were few and far between are the Congress people that are really up to speed on AI, how it's being deployed in social networks, what these social networks do as far as harvesting your data and surveilling you. They don't seem to even understand the basic business models. So I think at one point somebody asked Mark Zuckerberg, how do you make money? And he's like, yeah, well, we sell ads, duh. And so I think that's a big problem, because we basically have been kind of asleep at the switch for the last decade while these companies have come into huge monopolies. Maybe the FTC and other entities are going to finally get, the Justice Department is finally going to get some leadership, shall we say. The Republicans and Democrats, while they come at it from different angles, do agree that there's something wrong here, right? There's something wrong with social media. My own Senator Josh Hawley has proposed various regulations. He's often way off base, but he does seem to at least be trying something. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see if we can get some new blood in there. But one of the things that's also very disturbing that we've let these companies do, and I think could be reversed, is these are public companies, right? They're traded on public stock markets, but there's two shares of or classes of stock. And there's a voting class, and Mark Zuckerberg controls over 50% of that. So if you and I pooled our billions of dollars and we bought every bit of Facebook stock that was out there, we still wouldn't have a say in how Facebook is run because of these different classes of shares. So you now have one person determining what 2 or 3 billion people see. Mm-hmm. That's unprecedented in world history.
Right, and that's what I was saying. Where a couple of companies. I mean, I personally see the gap getting bigger. Mm-hmm. But again, I'm not psychic, so All right. Now about the robots taking over.
Okay.
All right. So we were talking about, we did get off track, but that was super interesting because that is, all of this interests me. And by the way, we have this conversation with my best friend who's my age. It interests me more as an observer because I have aged out of it. Whatever bad things happen, I'm 51 years old. I've made it.
Yep.
It's I have a daughter that's entering the world now. She's a junior in college, right? So this is the world she's walking into. That's what's scary. All right. So, talking about Moore's law, computing power getting faster, the cloud, there's no way to predict. Does artificial intelligence, do computers become sentient? So do they become self-aware and have consciousness? Is there a general, even a consensus that within the community, hey, this is coming soon? Or is it really just this unanswerable philosophical debate until it's in hindsight?
It seems to me the consensus used to be that we were going to have something fairly soon, but that has changed from what at least I've seen. So there are still some folks that are predicting the singularity, right? So where we get to a point where these computers are as intelligent as we are, or maybe we kind of merge with human consciousness, or maybe you can upload your consciousness into a computer. Like right. You, I'm lucky that I'm 52 years old now and will not have to deal with that. I do not want to be uploaded under no circumstance. Do I want to be uploaded into a computer?
I do.
And
forever, but anyways.
Yeah. So, but I think by and large, machine learning is really where it's at right now. And these machine learning algorithms are very specific. So while I think there's some folks that are very optimistic, like Ray Kurzweil, who now works for Google, and he's predicted that this will be coming in the next 10 years. So in the next 10 years, we'll achieve this kind of consciousness of a computer. By and large, most AI experts that I've listened to do not agree with that. So it may be a little bit of wishful thinking.
Well, is it Turing or Turing test? Is there a G?
No, Turing test, yeah.
Because that was passed a few years ago, right?
Yeah, if you actually look at the test, it's a kind of a weird test. But basically, the idea is, can you talk to a computer, and can you determine whether it's a computer or whether it's a human, right? So now, does that mean it has consciousness? Well, I would argue probably not. It can fake what a human is like in a human responses. Now, that may be great. It may have some wonderful applications for being able to do so. But Alan Turing was interesting because he did a lot of these thought experiments. Mm-hmm. Before him was a woman, and if you don't know much about her, you should look her up on Wikipedia or whatever, Lady Ada of Lovelace, and she helped Charles Babbage back in the 1850s and actually came up with the idea for a program. So she used the word algorithm, but it would be what we think of as a program. And she had some thought experiments as well. And so she started thinking, well, wait a second, I can make as a symbol music. I could make pictures as a symbol, and I could have this thing process all sorts of different symbols for me.
In the 1800s.
In the 1800s. So a rather remarkable young woman. And she came up with this idea of, could a computer ever think? And she decided that it couldn't, that it would never be able to think. And she reasoned this out. And it's called Lady Ada's objection. So in artificial intelligence, they call it Lady Ada's objection. Well, Alan Turing wrote a paper that disputed that. And he said that while AI or a computer could never write a symphony, or may not be able to write a symphony that you and I would like, it would probably write one that other computers would like. So for its own kind, right? So he distinguished it not, human consciousness was not the definition of consciousness, is what he kind of came up with. And so computers have a different type of consciousness that's unique to them. I don't know. We're going to have to get a philosopher in here to help us with
this. No, that's without a philosopher here to contradict us, we can pretend that we're philosophers. Well, I mean, that's what this is. I mean, this is 3,000 years ago in Greece, what we're doing right now, right? I mean, that's what's happening. Well, and by the way, for those listening, no hate mail. I didn't just compare myself to Aristotle. Like that's not my intent there. But the spirit is what it is. It's coffee shops during the Renaissance. How about that?
There you go.
That's a little bit more reasonable. So, and I do my best to avoid. I mean, I never debate religion or politics because it gives me heartburn. But it is relevant to certain conversations. Do you feel as though that the idea of computers will never be conscious, is there a religious bias in that? Like, is it, if God will not breathe consciousness into a computer, is there a line that tends to be people on one side or the other, or is that something I've just...
That's, I have not heard that religious argument brought up. That's maybe because a lot of computer scientists may be agnostic or atheist. I'm not sure, but that would be an interesting way to look at it, right? So different religions talk about the universe in different ways, right? So the Catholic Church has embraced the idea of the Big Bang, but this is just God's method for creating us, right? And that's fascinating. I haven't really thought about a religious argument against machine consciousness.
I've never really heard that either. I mean, I've read about it. Heinlein talked about, does a dog have a soul? Maybe. What about a virus? Nah. So I mean, it's not an original idea, but that is something that I was asking about because I haven't heard people talking about it, and I wondered if that was one of those lines that would make people biased towards thinking it could never happen.
I would think it would be, wouldn't you?
I would think so. But again, like you said, within this community, there's probably a lot more thinking about, programming on Sunday morning than getting out and socializing.
Right.
So what do you think about the idea that if computers did become conscious, and again, that's not conspiracy theory, a lot of very intelligent people feel like it's inevitable. If they achieve this level of consciousness, what does your gut tell you is the result? I mean, is there a working symbiotic relationship with humans, or again, this is impossible to predict. This is just campfire talk. But do you feel that this ends well for us?
I guess I'm always an optimist. So I am an optimist. I think there's lots of ways that if you had a computer that was conscious, that thought a little bit differently about things, it might come up with some better solutions than we're able to for a lot of these big global challenges that we're facing right now. I'm less optimistic that we're actually going to see that. But it brings up a whole level of thought experiments, I guess, as to whether this new type of consciousness has what rights does it have? We don't generally define things in terms of human rights. We talk about some people talk about animal rights, but generally we talk about animal welfare, right? So that's what we see in our laws is about animal welfare. Not that the animal particularly has standing in court or anything like that, but would a computer have standing in court if it is conscious? Could it argue that it needed to be expanded or needed to be unplugged or not unplugged? Would some of those ideas that came forth in that original Star Trek with Picard and Data, does Data have consciousness? Does Data actually have the right to decide his future? Does he have the right to resign from Starfleet? Or can he be taken apart by some mechanic at Starfleet's whim, right? So that was one of the great things about some of those shows, because they explored these ideas of what is consciousness and where does a artificial consciousness fit in as far as our legal system and our ideas about rights.
Yeah, I do love that. I'm old school nerd, and so science fiction has been a lot of real good science fiction writers also come from a scientific background. Not all of them, but some have. And so they do explore things that are ahead of their time, sometimes freakily so.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's where we look at like Asimov's rules of robots. You know, first, the robot will do no harm to a human. So do we build in those Asimov's laws of robotics into our AIs? So that's another, question of AI ethics.
Well, and then it lends itself to the question, does a conscious artificial intelligence choose to abide by its original programming?
Right.
Especially if it's smarter than us. I like, I'm a huge Heinlein fan. He's my favorite. And most of his future has been less about technology, more about society. But then he's explored the idea of a sentient machine in several of his books. And those were some of the questions, but he never dove as deep as I wanted. But I also think maybe it was more in the realm of fantasy then too. Like, why would you explore deep? Just the fact that it exists,
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Mike or Hal or Jane from the Ender series. I mean, that was all real science fiction not that long ago.
Yeah. There's a book by Neil Stephenson, also a science fiction writer, that he writes big books. So I will warn you, these are, 900,000 pages. But one that I listened to on audio called Fall or Dodge in Hell. And it actually was about some of the things we've been talking about here today. In this case, there was a entrepreneur who died, and his brain was eventually uploaded into the cloud. And how did he start to make sense of this? So it turns into kind of a fantasy novel. But the other thing that was fascinating about it was how AIs were used so that you could kind of stay in your little belief bubble. So in the future, everybody had AI glasses. So you would have your glasses, and it would be able to project different things. Mm-hmm. And it would filter out those things that don't fit with your beliefs. Okay. And it would add in or augment things that would fit with your beliefs. So if you believed in Zeus and you went out and you saw some lightning, you would see Zeus up there, throwing down the lightning bolts. And so this idea of having these filters on, and in that case, it was these AR glasses that everybody wore so they wouldn't have something that would challenge their beliefs. So I think if you look at what we're doing with Facebook and these other social media, that's kind of the same thing. He's just extrapolated it out to using an AI and these AR glasses. So I think science fiction can be a good place to start to think about some of these ideas, right?
Yeah, and as soon as you mentioned that, we're talking about the glasses and your belief systems it was projecting, my first thought was Facebook and politics. And so I was like, my gut went, no, I don't. We don't want that. We want to have it show other people's beliefs on there. That's even more important. But okay, so you gave me an hour of your time, and we're getting close. I want to backtrack to something because you mentioned something that I've been curious about and have never really understood, but it's talked about, which is uploading your consciousness into a machine. I don't understand what that means, because clearly we don't have the ability to go in and replicate our neural net, or is that what they're saying is on the horizon?
Well, there's a couple of, I think it's a shame that we use the word neural net when we talk about AI, because we assume that that's just like the human brain. It's not. Our neurons have many different connections. They're chemical devices as well as being electrical devices. But the idea is if you had a neural network that is as sophisticated as a brain, it's just our connections between our neurons what makes us human or what makes us remember different things. It's not clear whether that's true or not. So that's kind of the idea, but it's something that's confined to science fiction at this point. and that is, could you actually take somebody and kind of upload them into some sort of computer system? Now, Elon Musk has been looking at this idea of how do we link the brain with computers. So he has a company called Neuralink. They're first going to be able to put these different sensors in your brain to be able to understand brain activity, and then be able to affect some change in the real world. So at first, this might be used for people that are, quadriplegic or have MS or have some other problems physically that they need to overcome or might help them overcome. So you can imagine somebody that loses their speech or something like that being able to learn how to use this human-computer interface. His idea is that we need to develop it so that you could upload information. You could go the other way. Instead of going from the brain to the outside world, we could go from the outside world into your brain. I don't think the problem with our society is that we're consuming information too fast. In fact, I think we need to slow down a little bit. Might be a good idea. So I disagree with that, but I think there's some interesting applications. In fact, I don't have it here right now, but last night, my final class of the semester, we met for 2 hours with a company called Helium, and it's Heal, like HEALIM, and they use VR tied with these ECG bands. So it monitors your brainwave activity. So yesterday I was sitting here on my Zoom call with a little band on my head, and you can actually change this VR environment based on calming yourself down. So as you calm yourself down, more butterflies start flying around or hatching and stuff like that. And they found it can be a really good way to help people disengage from something that's really stressful, or even treat people that are, suffering. So right now we have a lot of what we call compassion fatigue by healthcare providers. So they have been, doing this COVID treatments, and, they're just getting overwhelmed. And so can they take 5 or 10 minutes and do something where they're getting this kind of biofeedback, and they're able to change this VR environment by focusing their brain, by relaxing, and help them train to be able to do that. And so it's kind of a mental health device, but it's pretty fascinating because they're now looking at, it can use one of these bands, or it can also use an Apple Watch, but they're looking at integrating with all sorts of different types of biometric sensors and being able to help people with very stressful anxiety, PTSD, all sorts of applications. And they've got a lot of scientific research. I think they published about 3 papers and have at least 1 patent. And so it's something you might want to check out. You can just download it on your phone and you can try it out. It's kind of interesting application. And I've once again have gone way off the topic of where you started, but this idea of human brain interface, right? So how do we interface with our brains?
It's so funny. I off track is great. And again, I won't keep you, but with my first thought when you talk about, well, when we connect and we can interface this way, look at all the things we can do for people with disabilities and people dealing with stress. And it reminds me, we're old enough, when the internet first became the internet, and it was all about all these scientific breakthroughs and communication, and then it was like 7 years driven by porn. And so as you're telling me this, I'm thinking these are these great noble things, but I wonder where society is actually going to start using this stuff. It's probably not going to be in these altruistic endeavors. I mean, we're people, so it'll be a fun show to watch.
Well, that company actually holds the patent on using brainwaves to affect something in VR. So I don't think that they will license it to any porn company or anything like that. So
maybe not. I don't trust people. I really appreciate your time. I want to talk to you for hours and hours, but that's I won't do that to you. We went a little bit over. I really, really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for your time. I will put a link on this page to every book, every app, everything we talked about. You have a newsletter If someone wants to follow you, and this is not even a financial endeavor, this is just you wanting to share information, or just real brief, tell me about your newsletter.
Yeah. So for some of the reasons we talked about here, I decided to delete Facebook and Instagram and all those accounts, because I decided it was not a company I wanted to be associated with, but I still wanted to share out what I've been reading, what neat things I've discovered, what little life hacks I've found. And so it's called The Free Range Technologist. If you just go to frt.news, you should find a link there. And it just comes out, maybe every 3 weeks or whenever I get enough time to put things together. And it's kind of nice because I also get a lot of replies, sometimes from former students or from former colleagues about what they're using. And so you can share with me, tips and techniques. Also, I have a website called learnabout.ai, and it has just links to a lot of the stuff we've talked about here today, like the universal paper clips and other books like AI Superpowers that you might want to check out.
Cool. I really appreciate that. Well, thank you for being on the show. I'm going to put a link. I'll send you everything. So if you want to post it on your page, would be awesome. But other than that, thank you so much.
All right. We'll talk to you later.